I was interning at a small newspaper one summer while I was still finishing up my degree in journalism. The internship I landed was in this tiny town in Vermont, but internships were hard to get, and I needed the experience, so I took it. The first month was horrifically boring. I wrote fluff pieces about apple festivals and parades and charity car washes. I knew that I wouldn't get anything particularly hard-hitting in such a small town, but I was hoping for at least one good story before I left. Unfortunately, it took a tragedy to get that one good story. 2 hikers had gone missing one weekend, while out in a state forest not far from town. Apparently, it did happen from time to time, given that the area was so wild and undeveloped, and many people were completely unprepared for the conditions. Although usually these issues were related to sudden bad weather, this was mid-July. There had been no storms in the last several weeks. The prevailing theory was that they had left the trail and got very lost or had possibly fallen. There were the normal search and rescue attempts from the local organizations, and some volunteer search parties were organized. I was sent out to do a human interest piece on the group that planned and supported the volunteer search efforts. I met them in a parking lot by the trail and interviewed a bunch of people. It was cool to see the process and how hard they worked to pull it all together. I was also hoping to hear some news firsthand. Even though it was way above the call of duty to participate in the search, I joined them on their next sweep. I figured it would add a little something extra to my story. Plus, it didn't feel right to just be standing around while everyone else was working so hard. I tagged along with a group of 4 locals who were heading into the woods. They had a whole coordinate system that I didn't understand, so I just followed along, making notes and keeping an eye out for the hikers. I could see firsthand how hard this was going to be. The park was absolutely massive, and the woods were thick and confusing. There were steep ravines everywhere, so the hikers could easily have tumbled off of one and might never be found. An hour in, we found a clue, and I was ecstatic that I had come along. Our group found a backpack on the ground way off the trail. There wasn't anything identifying in it, but it looked like it hadn't been out there very long, so it was a solid bet that it belonged to the couple. The search leader called it in and got more volunteers to fan the area, since it was likely they would be close to where we found the bag. A little while later, we found 2 hiking poles and started to get worried. We were hoping it wasn't a horrific injury. Rescue wouldn't be able to get to that section for hours, and no one wanted to wait in case someone was still alive but badly hurt. So, we kept going. We searched the area closely, assuming they may not have gotten too far. We did find a few more items like a water bottle, a sweatshirt, and a cell phone and tufts of fur, like they had been in a fight with a wild animal, but no actual people. It was weird. After we completely canvassed that area, we spread out even more. Soon things took a turn for the weird. That's when we saw the prints. Giant footprints, barefoot, huge, and oddly shaped like a human foot. We followed them for a while until they ended abruptly. They just stopped dead in the woods, without explanation. We hushed ourselves into complete silence, solemnly exploring the area, resigned to the fact that something awful had probably happened, and we might not be able to find out exactly what. Just then, we all heard a faint yell. We all started yelling back, and after searching a few minutes, we located the missing hikers. To everyone's surprise, they were curled up in a tree, clutching a thick tree branch, looking terrified. They were both traumatized and looked dehydrated. As we waited for rescue, some of the volunteers tried to talk to them to see what had happened. They didn't say much, but the man just kept muttering something. Finally, we asked him to say it slowly and clearly. That's when we heard it. He was saying, "Dog man." It was a dog man, over and over. We thought he was delirious, but then I thought about the weird footprints and the strange fur. But at that point in time, I kept my thoughts to myself. After the police and rescue teams arrived and got the 2 of them down, the man started talking a little more, hysterically describing the half-man, half-dog that they had seen in the woods that had terrified and chased them. He said it was huge and human-shaped, but covered in fur. They had been so terrified that they dropped everything and ran, but they kept feeling the presence of the creature looming behind them, and so decided to climb the tree, hoping it couldn't and wouldn't follow. Luckily, the man described watching the creature stop in its tracks, sniff at the air for a bit, and then spin around and run in the opposite direction. Back at the office, I had a choice to make. It was risky, but I chose to write the entire experience as honestly as I could. I described the scene and what the man had said, word for word. I didn't make any claims, but my story was pretty clear. The paper wouldn't print it and threatened me not to give my written account to anyone, so in the end I put it on Reddit, but changed the location and waited for comments to come in. Turns out lots of other people have had similar experiences and encounters, even if they didn't have to hide in a tree to survive. As for that town in Vermont, the official story was an unnamed animal attack, but I can attest to the fact that there are officials in that town who know the truth. They're just not talking about it. When I was 15, my parents moved us from our Chicago suburb to a tiny town up in northern Minnesota. My father had lost his job when the factory shut down, and he had a cousin who offered him work up there. I was obviously less than thrilled to be changing schools partway through high school, but moving to a freezing northern town made it 1,000,000 times worse. My parents insisted that it was a beautiful area, and that with the lakes nearby there was a ton of outdoor stuff we could do. We moved in June, just after we finished the school year. As it turned out, the summer wasn't awful. It was surprisingly nice and warm, which I hadn't expected. My dad's cousin let us use his boat, and we spent a lot of time out on the lake. Dad took us fishing a few times, and we even started playing hockey, just to fit in. Then in the fall, school started. The new school we went to was ridiculously small compared to my school back in Chicago, but I made some friends pretty quickly, and I decided that I could survive these last 2 years before returning to Chicago for college. Then, winter hit. Winter in Chicago had been tough, so I thought I was prepared. Nope. This was absolute hell. The temperature was regularly in the single digits, if not below zero. Also, we were close enough to the lake that the wind chill dropped it another 20 degrees. I barely left my room most days, except for school or hockey practice. By February, I was going stir-crazy. Then by spring, we started to get warm spells, and out of desperation, my brother and I begged my parents to take us somewhere, anywhere, just to get outside. They ended up suggesting we spend the weekend at a state forest about an hour away. Our parents had bought everyone kayaks for Christmas as a peace offering for the move. The park had tons of lakes and rivers, so we were going to kayak and hike and camp overnight. We got to the park Saturday morning with no problem. We found a campsite, set up, and then lugged our boats to a launch point. We floated around the lake for hours, taking pictures of wildlife, fishing, and just hanging out. When we returned to the campsite, we walked around for a little while, but then made a campfire and had dinner. Despite the abnormally warm day, it was still supposed to get cold overnight, so we had brought extra blankets and lots of them. The paddling had taken a lot out of us, so we all fell asleep right away. In the middle of the night, I woke up needing to go to the bathroom. I ignored it for as long as I could, not wanting to get out of my sleeping bag, but eventually I had no choice. I wrestled my way out, trying not to wake my brother up, and threw on boots and my coat. The tents were in a clearing, but there was a small stand of trees maybe 20 yards away, so I headed there. I definitely wasn't going all the way to the campsite bathrooms. I didn't bring a flashlight because the moon was bright enough that I could basically see where I was going, and I wasn't going far anyway. I stepped a few feet into the trees and took care of business. Just as I was finishing up, I heard a sound. Definitely an animal sound. I wasn't scared, just curious. I was still getting used to seeing wildlife everywhere, and I had a running tally of the things I'd seen in the wild lately. I was hoping it was something cool, like an elk or moose, maybe even a wolf, although that probably would totally scare me. I stayed silent, waiting to see what it was. I heard a few more faint sounds, but couldn't see anything. I was freezing, so I decided to head back to the tent. Just then, I saw something moving between the tree branches. Based on how tall it was sure it was definitely a moose or elk. I thought about trying to wake my family up quietly because I was sure they wouldn't believe me, but I was afraid it would be gone before we could all get back to see it. So, I stood still and kept watching. After a minute, I saw a flash of something moving again and heard it getting closer to me. It came out from between a stand of thick, evergreen trees. At first, I couldn't figure out what I was seeing. I saw the face first and immediately thought wolf, but the head was way too high. Besides, the face was just wrong. And then out came the rest of it, and I saw its body. It was walking on 2 legs. It was tall, at least 8 or 9 feet tall. The body wasn't completely human. The arms were too long and it was slightly hunched. The legs were muscular, and all 4 limbs ended in claws. The whole body was completely covered in fur, dark brown, almost black fur. The creature stared right at me with glowing amber eyes that were far too intelligent. It opened its mouth and let out a weird half pant, half grunt, letting me see its razor-sharp teeth. That was enough to send me running. I screamed the whole way back to our tents and headed for my parents' tent. Of course, by the time they got up, the hideous creature was gone, and of course, they didn't believe me. They insisted that I was either still asleep or had seen shadows playing tricks on me in the woods. But I knew what I saw. Back home, I searched online and eventually found exactly what I was looking for. Some pictures were different, but a few were almost identical to what I had seen that night. They were calling it a dog man. In the spring of 2006, when I was about 12, my dad and I took a road trip to Denver, Colorado to visit my grandma for a few weeks. We were originally going to fly, but my dad figured it would be a cool experience to drive so we could enjoy the sights and sounds along the way and get some fresh air. It would also be good to have our own car there. We lived in northern Nevada, so it was about a 15-hour ride to Denver. We packed the car and headed out on a weekend in early April. The ride was kind of boring at first. I spent most of my time playing my Game Boy Advance while Dad drove. We stopped by local restaurants, took some photos, and even stopped to relax for a bit at some hot sulfur springs. Then, once we got further into Colorado, Dad took one of the more scenic routes. He decided to drive along Peak to Peak Highway, a road that is a few miles north of Denver. The road is about 30 or 40 miles long, something like that. We would check it out and then continue down to Denver after. It was beautiful out there. The trees, the mountain ranges, and the cool air. We had gotten there a little late, and before we knew it, it was already nighttime. The road is in the middle of the mountains and doesn't have any lights. Dad had to rely solely on our headlights to see where we were going. It got pretty dark out there, and we couldn't drive very fast. And there weren't really any other cars out this late on the highway. There were 2 or 3 we passed when it was light out, but once it got dark, we maybe saw one. My dad was pretty tired from the drive, and we didn't have any signal on the radio, so he asked me to talk to him to keep him awake. I started asking him a bunch of random questions about Grandma and what it was like growing up. We talked for a bit and were deep in conversation when suddenly I thought I could make out a figure far in the distance, but I wasn't sure. As we got closer, I started to see something becoming more visible. It was standing in the middle of the road with its hand straight out in front of it. I yelled to my dad a bunch of times to stop. I was panicking, and he finally braked. That's when we finally saw it. The creature had huge, hairy hands with long fingernails like claws. It was maybe 8 or 9 feet tall and was standing on 2 legs. It was hairy, but not completely. I could see its muscular gray skin beneath its fur. I couldn't make out the face. Its hand was still up and in the way, but its legs were like a dog's, but the feet were longer, with long nails like its hands. It lowered its hand, and we saw that it had a face like a wolf's, with yellow, piercing eyes, and it was snarling at us. My dad and I were frozen and couldn't get our words out. This thing was just staring us down. Finally, it moved and took a few steps towards us. This snapped Dad out of it. He put the car in reverse, and after he got a bit of distance from it, he turned the car around and sped away in the direction we had come from. I was terrified. I asked Dad over and over what was that, but he just kept telling me to calm down, to relax. But I started to freak out even more. Outside my dad's window, I could see it running right alongside us. We were speeding down the road, but this thing was keeping up with us like it was nothing. I yelled and told Dad that it was right next to us to go faster. He didn't look over and stayed focused on driving, but he told me to grab the roof handle above my seat and to hold on, and slammed the gas pedal to the floor. I closed my eyes and started praying. We just drove and drove for I don't know how long. Then I finally felt the car start to slow down, and Dad told me to open my eyes. We hadn't realized that we had lost the creature, but it was gone. We reached Grandma's in the early morning, but my dad told me not to mention anything about what we had seen. The experience shook both pretty badly. My dad and I would talk about it with each other, reading stories online and trying to figure out what we had seen. We debated if maybe all we saw was a bear, but we both knew that made no sense. The speed this thing ran at, and on two legs, didn't make sense. Dad always reminded me not to mention this story to anyone, afraid that people might think we were both crazy, but I felt like I had to share this story with you. We saw the dog man, and letting you know he exists might help you someday too. It was the end of summer in 2009, and my mom and I were taking a last-minute weekend trip to see my grandparents before school started. My grandparents lived out in the middle of nowhere, or so I called it. I was a teenager at the time, and being out in the woods wasn't really my thing. There was nothing to do but sit around the kitchen talking with my mom and grandma, or hanging out with my grandfather in his woodworking shop. He loved to tinker around, making all sorts of wooden things. Anything from bowls on his lathe to tables and chairs that he sometimes sold at local swap meets. When we arrived at their house, Mom headed inside, and I went straight to the wood shop to look for my pap. Sure enough, I found him in there working on something I had never seen him make before. He was leaning forward, carving a bust out of a piece of wood, but it didn't look like a human head. He was carving some kind of animal, something with long fur all over its head. I watched him for a while and finally asked what he was making. He looked me straight in the eyes and asked if I had ever heard of a dog man. I slowly shook my head, no, and wondered for a minute what he was talking about. It sounded like some sort of mythical creature to me. Like, was it a dog or was it a man? He sat the piece of wood down and asked me to come sit next to him. He said he had something to tell me, now that I was old enough to handle it. The story he was about to tell me had happened 25 years prior, in 1984, way before I was born, but he still thinks about it every day. The day that he saw a creature that he's convinced lives somewhere in the woods near their house, but he can't prove it. It was October of 1984, and he was working on building the wood shop back then. He was doing it all on his own by cutting his own timber and planing it himself. Back then, he was still working his job and had to do a lot of the building at night. During the summer, this was fine since the sun set late, but in the fall, the days were starting to get shorter. One evening, he had worked a little longer than usual, forgetting how soon the sun was now setting. It was already dark by the time he started cleaning up his tools and bringing them all inside for the night. As he was putting them all away, he realized that he couldn't find his axe anywhere. He looked all around the work area outside the garage door before realizing that he must have forgotten it out in the woods where he had just cut down a tree. Now you've got to understand my pap. He's super meticulous and would never be able to sleep if it wasn't in its proper spot in his garage. Little did he know that something else was about to happen that would make sleeping difficult for years to come. He grabbed a flashlight and wandered off into the woods to find the axe. He knew those woods like the back of his hand and wasn't nervous at all, but said that something didn't feel right that night. He had a weird feeling like he wasn't alone. He retraced his steps back in the direction of the cut tree, but kept hearing a low rumbling noise that made him stop and listen. Each time he stopped, the noise stopped, and when he started again, the noise started again. He described the noise as a low growl, or deep breathing noise, a noise that he'd never heard before in his life. Finally, he reached the tree, and sure enough, the axe was stuck in the stump waiting for him to grab it. Happy to have found it, he grabbed it and quickly turned around to get back home before Grandma started worrying about him. He swung the flashlight around and took one step towards home when he came face to face with a creature whose features stunned him and froze him in mid-step. The creature towered above him, blocking his path back to the house. It was completely covered in dark, black fur, but it was thin and muscular, human-like a man with the face of a dog and standing on two back legs. The two of them stood there staring at each other, my grandpa frozen in place, and the dog-like creature gazing down with its amber eyes glowing back at him in the light of the flashlight. Grandpa said that all he could think about was the drool dripping from the creature's mouth, and he thought for sure he was a goner. But just as quickly as the encounter happened, the human dog creature leapt off into the woods, letting out a howl that sounded like a human screaming. Grandpa listened to the horrifying howls until they became faint enough that he felt safe to continue on the path back home. When he finally got there, Grandma was a mess, wondering what had happened to him. He told her he had gone off for the axe and had gotten off the path and mixed up in the dark woods. She could see from the look on his face that it was something else, that he hadn't gotten lost. Besides, he knew those woods like the back of his hand. That day in the wood shop, he told me that he never did tell Grandma what he saw, and that I was the first person in 25 years to hear the story. But even still, he thought of that creature every day, and never went back into the woods at night and never forgot his tools again. With that, he handed me the carved bust that I could now see was this dog-man creature, and he told me never to forget what lives in the woods. I attended my first music festival a few years ago. It was a small local one, nothing big or crazy like Coachella. There were probably only 2,000 attendees at most. The festival lasted 3 days, and my friends and I were some of the maybe 500 people who camped out overnight. There were 3 small campsites erected in the field not far from the stages, and they were very primitive. Just some designated spots for tents and a few porta potties. The festival happened in a fairly open field, with trees lining the edges of the field. It was intentionally held in an area far out of town to avoid annoying residents with the sounds of music and partying. The first night of camping went fine, although it wasn't very comfortable, or quiet since some people stayed up all night drinking. The second night, my friends and I tried to go to sleep around 3 a.m. There were 4 of us, and 2 tents, so I was sharing with my best friend. Our campground was decently quiet by that point, fortunately, and we hoped for a better night's sleep than the first night. But before we could fall asleep, we heard the screaming. Not the fun, playful kind of screaming, but horror movie screaming. We all scrambled out of our tents trying to see what was going on. The moon was behind the clouds, and the site only had a few mounted lights leading to the bathrooms, so it was very dark. Too dark for us to see what was happening. But we could tell that at the far end of our campground, there was some kind of commotion, a group of crying and screaming girls, and a large crowd of people around them trying to calm them down. We watched for a minute but didn't get closer. It didn't appear to be a real emergency. We were getting ready to get back in our tents when the second round of screaming started. This time it was on the other side of the field. 3 guys came running out of their tents, yelling something we couldn't understand. Something was definitely going on, and I was starting to get a bit worried, but didn't have a clue what it was. After the 3rd round of screaming erupted, we heard someone yell something about a dog, which was even more confusing. Why on earth would people be this freaked out by a dog? And we hadn't seen any dog running around, or heard any barking or growling. But the campsite was in chaos by that point. It didn't help that at least half of the campers were drunk or on other party favors, making them easily confused and excitable. Some of them had run out of the field to their cars, but there was one big group huddled together, waving their flashlights around wildly. We wanted to go get the whole story, so we approached the group. We found a sober-looking younger guy and asked him what was going on. He told us that people were seeing some kind of massive feral dog in the campground. It had nearly attacked the girls, and then it had shredded the tent of the group of guys. While he was telling us this, I could hear the one hysterical girl insisting that it wasn't a dog, but I didn't understand what she was trying to say. Was it a dog or not? There was a debate going about calling the police, but it would probably take them a good 20 or 30 minutes to get out here. Other people wanted to run for their cars, but were too scared to run across the open field. We were still highly baffled as to why people were so freaked out. No one had gotten hurt, and there was a discrepancy about what was even out there. I was starting to suspect group hysteria and possibly a poor stray dog in the wrong place at the wrong time. I talked my friends into going back to our tents, since there was no point in standing out in the field all night. We walked back to our site without issue and climbed in our tents once again. My friend and I sat up for a while, waiting to see if there would be more noise before trying to sleep. 10 minutes later, as we sat and talked about the festival, a giant shadow passed really close to our tent and paused in front of it before continuing on. It was tall, so we assumed it was a person, but we decided not to unzip our door to check. A minute later, we heard more screaming, really close this time. Someone tapped on our tent, yelling at us to run. We were really scared at this point and hurried outside. We saw that most of the big group had dispersed, and they were all running in different directions. Not far behind them was something big and dark. I peered into the dark field, trying to figure out what it was. It was running on 2 legs, like a person, but wasn't really human-shaped. It was thicker, and the head was too big. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it towards the dark shape. I could instantly see what the confusion had been. I felt it too. The head of the thing was a dog's head, long snout, big fangs, yellow eyes, but the body was more human-like than dog-like. The legs and torso were long and thin. The reason the shape had looked weird to me was the thick, dark fur all over the body. As it got closer and we finally saw it clearly, we started running too. We darted for the parking lot with everyone else. I only turned around once, but I saw it drop to all 4s and lope into the woods. We got to our car and drove away, leaving our tents and sleeping bags behind. The festival did resume the next day as normal, but it closed down at midnight and our campsite was roped off. The official story was a coyote attack, despite at least 20-some witnesses saying otherwise. The fact that most witnesses were inebriated lost us all credibility. I saw some internet stories about the festival dogman, so I knew other people had seen what I had seen. It was obvious that we all knew what we had seen, even if no one did believe us.